Sarah Martinez had always believed that healing was her calling. At 26, she had spent 3 years working as a combat medic in the mountain regions where conflict had torn communities apart for decades. Her hands, steady and sure, had saved countless lives. She carried her medical bag with the same reverence others might hold a sacred text. The morning sun painted the rocky landscape in shades of gold and amber as Sarah checked her supplies for the 3rd time. Her unit was stationed at Forward Operating Base Sierra, a collection of reinforced structures built into the mountainside. The base served both as a medical outpost and a strategic checkpoint, monitoring the valley below where supply routes snaked between villages. "Doc, we've got incoming wounded from Patrol Alpha," called out Sergeant Mike Chen, jogging toward the medical tent. His face was streaked with sweat and dust, but his voice remained calm. Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs in her teammates' voices. Today, Mike's tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. Sarah grabbed her trauma kit and rushed outside. The helicopter's rotor blades created a whirlwind of dust and debris as it landed on the makeshift helipad. 3 soldiers were carried off on stretchers, their uniforms torn and bloodied. She immediately went to work, her training taking over as she assessed each patient. The first soldier had shrapnel wounds to his leg. Sarah quickly applied pressure bandages and started an IV line. The second had suffered a concussion from an explosion. She checked his pupils, monitoring for signs of brain injury. The third soldier was the most critically injured, with a gunshot wound to his abdomen. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, applying pressure to stop the bleeding while calling for additional medical supplies. "What happened out there?" Sarah asked Mike as she worked on stabilizing the wounded soldiers. "Ambush in the valley. 3 vehicles hit by roadside bombs, then small arms fire from the ridgeline. Patrol Alpha took heavy casualties," Mike replied, his jaw clenched. "Intelligence says there's been increased enemy movement in the area for the past week." Sarah had heard similar reports before, but something felt different this time. The attacks were becoming more coordinated, more strategic. The enemy seemed to know exactly where the patrols would be and when. As she worked to save lives, a nagging worry began to grow in the back of her mind. Over the next few hours, Sarah managed to stabilize all 3 wounded soldiers. The most critical patient was airlifted to the main hospital, while the other 2 would recover at the base. As she cleaned her medical equipment, Sarah reflected on why she had chosen this path. Growing up in a small town in Arizona, Sarah had watched her grandmother work as a nurse during the community health crises. Her grandmother had taught her that healing was not just about treating wounds, but about giving people hope when everything seemed lost. When Sarah enlisted, she specifically requested training as a combat medic because she wanted to be where she was needed most. "You did good work today, Doc," said Corporal James Rivera as he helped Sarah restock the medical supplies. James was one of the newer members of their unit, barely 21 years old. He had joined them 2 months ago, fresh from advanced training. "It's what we're here for," Sarah replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. The frequency of attacks had increased dramatically over the past month. More wounded soldiers were coming through their medical tent, and the injuries were becoming more severe. That evening, Sarah sat outside the medical tent, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear mountain sky. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of generators and the occasional radio chatter from the command post. She thought about the 3 soldiers she had treated that day and wondered about their families back home. Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes, the base commander, approached her position. He was a veteran with 20 years of service, and Sarah had learned to respect his judgment. His expression was serious as he sat down beside her. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something," he began, using her first name instead of her rank, which was unusual. "Intelligence reports suggest that the enemy is planning a major offensive in this sector. We might be facing the largest coordinated attack we've seen in years." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "How long do we have?" "Could be days, could be weeks. But when it comes, we need to be ready for anything," Hayes continued. "I've been watching you work, and you're one of the best medics I've served with. But I need you to understand that circumstances might require all of us to do things we never planned on doing." The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She had always focused on her role as a healer, but she understood what he was implying. In extreme situations, even medics might need to take up arms to defend themselves and their patients. "Sir, I took an oath to do no harm," Sarah said quietly. "I know you did, and I respect that. But sometimes protecting lives means making impossible choices," Hayes replied. "I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to be prepared for situations where the rules might not apply." As the night wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories. During World War II, her grandmother had served as a nurse in field hospitals near the front lines. She had once told Sarah about a night when enemy soldiers had attempted to overrun their hospital. The medical staff had to choose between abandoning their patients or fighting to protect them. Sarah had never imagined she would face similar choices. Her training had prepared her to save lives under fire, but not to take them. Yet as she looked around the base, she realized that everyone there depended on each other for survival. The lines between roles became blurred when lives were at stake. The next morning brought news that would test everything Sarah believed about her mission. A reconnaissance patrol had spotted enemy forces massing in the valleys below and intercepted. Communication suggested that forward operating base Sierra was their primary target. The attack could come within 48 hours. As Sarah prepared her medical station for what might be the fight of their lives, she couldn't know that the decisions she would make in the coming days would fundamentally change not only her understanding of her role as a medic, but her entire view of what it meant to protect and serve others in the face of impossible circumstances. The attack began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when the mountain mist still clung to the valleys below. Sarah was checking inventory in the medical tent when the first mortar rounds exploded near the base perimeter. The distinctive whistle of incoming shells sent everyone diving for cover as debris rained down from the sky. "Incoming! Take cover!" Sergeant Chen's voice boomed across the base as soldiers scrambled to defensive positions. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and rushed toward the command bunker, following established protocols for treating casualties under fire. The enemy had chosen their timing perfectly. The morning patrol had just left the base, reducing their defensive capabilities by nearly a third. From her position in the bunker, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the ridgelines surrounding their position. The attacking force had positioned themselves on three sides, creating a deadly crossfire that made movement across the base extremely dangerous. "Doc, we've got wounded at Checkpoint 2, came the urgent call over the radio. Checkpoint 2 was the most exposed position on the base, located near the main entrance where the attacking force was concentrating their fire. Sarah looked at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who was coordinating the defense from the command post. His face was grim as he studied the tactical display showing enemy positions. "I can't spare anyone to escort you, Sarah. It's too hot out there." "I have to try, sir. Those men are counting on me," Sarah replied, adjusting the straps on her medical kit. She had never left wounded soldiers behind, and she wasn't about to start now. Hayes nodded with reluctant respect. "Take the covered route along the north wall. Radio every 30 seconds so we know you're alive." Sarah sprinted from the bunker, keeping low as bullets whined overhead. The covered route was partially protected by concrete barriers, but several sections remained exposed to sniper fire. As she moved through the base, she passed positions where her fellow soldiers were returning fire, with everything they had. At Checkpoint 2, she found Corporal Rivera and Private Tom Walsh both wounded. Rivera had taken shrapnel to his shoulder and arm, while Walsh had been hit by rifle fire in the leg. Both men were conscious but losing blood rapidly. "Hang on, guys. I'm here now," Sarah said, immediately beginning triage procedures. Rivera's wounds were serious but not life-threatening. Walsh's leg wound had nicked an artery, requiring immediate attention to prevent him from bleeding to death. Working under fire tested every skill Sarah had learned. She had to apply pressure bandages and start IV lines while explosions shook the ground around them. Every few minutes she had to duck as sniper bullets struck the concrete walls nearby. "Doc, they're massing for an assault on the main gate," Rivera said through gritted teeth. Despite his wounds, he was still monitoring the tactical radio. "They've got at least 50 fighters moving up the approach road." Sarah realized that their position at Checkpoint 2 would be overrun within minutes. She made a quick decision that saved all their lives. Using her radio, she called for smoke grenades to be deployed between their position and the main gate. Under cover of the thick white smoke, she managed to drag both wounded soldiers back toward the medical bunker. The base's defensive positions were holding for now, But Sarah could see that they were running low on ammunition. The attacking force seemed to have unlimited supplies and reinforcements, while the defenders were trapped with no way to call for support. The radio equipment had been damaged in the initial mortar barrage, cutting off their communications with headquarters. As Sarah worked to stabilize Rivera and Walsh in the medical bunker, she overheard Hayes speaking with his senior sergeants. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fighters had managed to breach the perimeter wire on the east side of the base, and a fierce firefight was raging near the ammunition storage area. "We're down to our last reserve of medical supplies," Sarah reported to Hayes during a brief lull in the fighting. "If this continues much longer, I won't be able to treat serious casualties." Hayes looked at her with the expression of a commander who was running out of options. "How many wounded do we have right now?" 7 soldiers with serious injuries, another 12 with minor wounds who can still fight," Sarah replied. "But sir, if we take many more casualties, we won't have enough healthy soldiers to defend the base." The reality of their situation was becoming clear to everyone. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from support. The attacking force had them surrounded and was slowly tightening the noose around the base. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself moving constantly between wounded soldiers, scattered across different defensive positions. Each trip across the base became more dangerous as enemy snipers adjusted their aim, and mortar teams refined their targeting. She began to understand how thin the line was between healer and warrior in a situation like this. During one particularly intense exchange of gunfire, Sarah was treating a wounded machine gunner when his position came under direct assault. 3 enemy fighters had breached the wire and were advancing on their bunker with automatic weapons. The machine gunner, Private Anderson, was unconscious from blood loss and couldn't defend himself. Sarah found herself alone with an unconscious soldier as armed enemies approached their position. She could hear their voices getting closer, speaking in a language she didn't recognize but with intent she understood perfectly. They were conducting a systematic search of the defensive positions, eliminating wounded soldiers who couldn't surrender. This moment crystallized everything Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had tried to prepare her for. Her medical training had taught her to preserve life at all costs, but preserving Anderson's life and her own might require her to take actions she had never imagined. The approaching voices grew louder, and Sarah realized she had perhaps 30 seconds before the enemy fighters discovered their position. Looking down at Anderson's unconscious form, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like never before. This young soldier had a family back home who was counting on him to return safely. His life was literally in her hands, and the decisions she made in the next few moments would determine whether he lived or died. The sound of boots on gravel told Sarah that the enemy fighters were now less than 20 meters away. She could hear them checking each defensive position methodically, and she knew they would reach her location within moments. Anderson was still unconscious and couldn't be moved without causing potentially fatal damage to his internal injuries. As Sarah crouched in the bunker beside her patient, she realized that her role as a medic was about to be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The approaching footsteps grew closer, and she understood that the next few minutes would define not only who she was as a soldier, but who she was as a human being faced with an impossible choice between her oath to heal and her duty to protect. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for Private Anderson's rifle lying beside him in the bunker. The weapon felt foreign and heavy in her grip, nothing like the familiar weight of her medical instruments. She had qualified with various weapons during basic training, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Her fingers found the safety switch, and muscle memory from training exercises began to return. The voices outside the bunker were now close enough that she could distinguish individual words, though she couldn't understand the language. Through a crack in the concrete wall, she could see the shadows of at least 3 figures moving systematically through the defensive positions. One of them kicked over an empty ammunition box, the metallic clatter echoing across the battlefield. Anderson stirred slightly, a low moan escaping his lips. Sarah immediately placed her hand gently over his mouth, not to silence him cruelly, but to prevent him from giving away their position while he was disoriented. His eyes fluttered open, confusion and pain evident in his gaze. "Stay quiet," Sarah whispered directly into his ear. "Enemy fighters are right outside. Don't move, no matter what happens." Anderson's training kicked in despite his injuries. He nodded slightly to show he understood, then closed his eyes again to conserve his strength. Sarah could see that his bandages were holding, but he was in no condition to fight or even move quickly. The first enemy fighter appeared at the entrance to their bunker. He was young, perhaps no older than Anderson, with intense dark eyes scanning the interior. His weapon was raised and ready to fire. For a split second, Sarah and the fighter made eye contact across the small space. Time seemed to slow as Sarah realized this was the moment everything would change. She could see the fighter's finger tightening on his trigger as he began to swing his weapon toward Anderson's prone form. Without conscious thought, Sarah raised her rifle and fired. The sound of the gunshot in the enclosed space was deafening. Sarah's ears rang as she watched the fighter stumble backward and fall. She had aimed for center mass, just as she had been taught in training. But the reality of what she had just done hit her like a physical blow. Shouts erupted from outside the bunker as the other fighters reacted to the gunshot. Sarah could hear them communicating urgently, probably trying to determine how many defenders were in the position. She had perhaps seconds before they coordinated an assault on the bunker. Anderson was looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and shock. He had witnessed Sarah transform from medic to warrior in an instant, and he understood that she had just saved both their lives. With considerable effort, he managed to whisper, "Thank you, Doc." Sarah positioned herself where she could cover the bunker entrance while still staying close enough to Anderson to protect him. Her medical training helped her remain calm as adrenaline flooded her system. She focused on controlling her breathing and keeping her hands steady, just as she would when performing surgery under pressure. The second fighter appeared at the entrance, this time more cautiously. He tried to use the doorframe as cover while scanning the interior, but the bunker's design left him partially exposed. Sarah had a clear shot, but she hesitated for a crucial second. This hesitation nearly cost her life as the fighter spotted her position and began to raise his weapon. The sound of her second shot seemed even louder than the first. This time, Sarah didn't hesitate to engage additional targets that might threaten her patient. She was beginning to understand that in this situation, her role as a protector of life might require her to take decisive action against those who threatened the lives of her patients and fellow soldiers. The third fighter decided on a different approach. Instead of exposing himself at the entrance, he began to circle around to a position where he could throw a grenade into the bunker. Sarah realized what was happening when she heard his footsteps moving along the outside wall. Acting on instinct, Sarah left Anderson's side and moved to a firing position near a different part of the bunker wall. When the fighter appeared at what he thought was a blind spot, Sarah was ready for him. Her third shot was the most difficult, taken at an awkward angle while trying to protect both Anderson and herself. The sudden silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the gunfire had been. Sarah's hands were shaking now that the immediate threat had passed, but she forced herself to remain alert. There could be more fighters in the area, and Anderson still needed medical attention. "Doc, are you okay?" Anderson asked weakly. Sarah looked at her hands, still holding the rifle. They were steady now, but she could feel the emotional impact of what she had just done beginning to set in. She had crossed a line that she never expected to cross, but she had done it to protect a patient who couldn't protect himself. "I'm okay," she replied, though she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "How are you feeling? Any changes in your pain levels?" Even in the aftermath of combat, Sarah's medical instincts remained strong. She quickly checked Anderson's bandages and vital signs, confirming that the excitement hadn't caused any additional bleeding or complications from his injuries. Over the radio, she could hear reports from other parts of the base indicating that the main assault was being repelled. The defenders had managed to hold their positions and the attacking force appeared to be withdrawing. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief, knowing that help would soon arrive. When Sergeant Chen and 2 other soldiers reached their position 15 minutes later, they found Sarah back in full medic mode, tending to Anderson's wounds while the 3 enemy fighters lay motionless outside the bunker. "Jesus, Doc, what happened here?" Chen asked, surveying the scene with professional interest. "They tried to overrun our position while I was treating Anderson," Sarah replied simply. "I couldn't let them hurt him." Chen nodded with understanding. He had seen combat medics forced into similar situations before, though it never got easier to witness. "You did what you had to do. Anderson's alive because of your actions." As they prepared to evacuate Anderson to the main medical facility, Sarah picked up her medical kit and slung the rifle over her shoulder. The weight of both seemed different now, as if the balance between healing and protecting had permanently shifted in her understanding. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes arrived just as they were loading Anderson onto a stretcher. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of respect and concern, understanding immediately what had transpired. "How are you doing, Sarah?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question carefully. She had taken 3 lives to save one, and the moral complexity of that equation would require time to fully process. But she also knew that Anderson would return to his family because of her actions. "I'm still a medic, sir," she replied. "But I think I understand now what you meant about impossible choices." The weeks following the attack brought an unsettling quiet to Forward Operating Base Sierra. Sarah continued her duties as a medic, but everything felt different now. Word of what had happened in the bunker spread quickly through the base, and soldiers began looking at her with a new kind of respect mixed with curiosity. She was no longer just the doc who patched them up. She was the doc who had proven she would fight to protect her patients. Private Anderson recovered well from his injuries and was eventually transferred back to a rear area for final rehabilitation. Before he left, he sought out Sarah at the medical tent. The conversation was brief but meaningful. "Doc, I need you to know something," Anderson said, his voice serious. "What you did that day. My wife and kids will never know how close they came to losing me, but they won't lose me because you were willing to do something that went against everything you believe in." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. "I'm just glad you're going home, Anderson. That's all that matters." But privately, Sarah struggled with the moral implications of her actions. She had taken 3 lives, and while she understood intellectually that it was necessary to save Anderson, the emotional impact was profound. She found herself questioning fundamental beliefs about her role and purpose. The base chaplain, Captain Williams, noticed the change in Sarah's demeanor during their regular conversations. Williams was an experienced combat veteran who had counseled many soldiers through similar moral crises. "Sarah, you're carrying a heavy burden," Williams observed during one of their talks. "You saved a life by taking lives, and that's a complexity that many people never have to face." "I became a medic to heal people, not to kill them," Sarah replied. "How do I reconcile that with what I had to do?" Williams considered her question carefully. Maybe the answer isn't about reconciling opposing forces, but about understanding that sometimes healing requires protection. "You didn't stop being a healer when you picked up that rifle. You expanded your definition of what healing can mean." These philosophical discussions helped, but Sarah found that her real healing came through her continued work with patients. Every life she saved, every wound she treated reminded her of why she had chosen this path. The rifle she now carried alongside her medical kit became a symbol not of violence, but of her commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The enemy attacks continued sporadically over the following months, though none approached the intensity of that dawn assault. Sarah found herself adapting to a new reality where medical work and combat readiness had to coexist. She practiced regularly with her weapons, ensuring that she could protect her patients if the situation arose again. Her reputation began to extend beyond Forward Operating Base Sierra. Other medical units in the region requested her consultation on defensive procedures and trauma treatment under fire. Sarah discovered that her unique experience made her valuable in ways she hadn't anticipated. During one such consultation at a neighboring base, Sarah met Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a civilian doctor working with an international aid organization. Dr. Chen had heard about Sarah's actions and wanted to discuss the ethical implications with someone who had lived through such an experience. "I've been thinking about your situation," Dr. Chen said over coffee in the aid station. "In civilian medicine, we sometimes face similar dilemmas. Not with weapons, but with triage decisions where saving one life might mean letting another die. The scale is different, but the moral weight is similar." Sarah found this perspective helpful. "You're saying that impossible choices aren't unique to combat situations?" "Exactly. What makes your situation different is the directness of it. In civilian medicine, our impossible choices are often more abstract. You had to physically act to protect your patient, which makes the moral complexity more immediate and personal." This conversation helped Sarah understand that her experience, while traumatic, had given her insights into the nature of healing and protection that few medics ever gained. She began to see her role not as compromised, but as evolved. The real test of this evolution came 6 months later during a medical emergency in a nearby village. Intelligence reports indicated that the village was caught between competing armed groups, with civilians trapped in the middle. A request came through official channels for medical personnel to assist with evacuating wounded civilians. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called Sarah into his office to discuss the mission. "This isn't a military operation, Sarah. It's a humanitarian mission, but the area is unstable. I need someone who understands both medical priorities and security concerns." Sarah accepted the mission without hesitation. She assembled a small medical team and coordinated with a security detail for the evacuation operation. The village was a 3-hour drive through disputed territory, requiring careful planning and constant vigilance. When they arrived at the village, Sarah found a situation that tested every skill she had developed. There were 17 wounded civilians, including several children, who needed immediate medical attention. At the same time, armed groups controlled different sections of the village, creating a complex security environment. Sarah established a triage area in the village school, which offered the best combination of space and protection. As she worked to stabilize the most critically wounded patients, she maintained constant communication with the security team about potential threats. The most challenging case was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, who had been caught in crossfire between the opposing groups. She had multiple gunshot wounds and was in critical condition. Sarah knew that the girl needed surgery that could only be performed at a proper medical facility, but moving her in her current condition could be fatal. While Sarah worked on the girl, reports came in that one of the armed groups was moving toward the school. The security team prepared defensive positions, but their primary mission was medical evacuation, not combat. Sarah found herself once again balancing her roles as healer and protector. "Doc, we need to move in 10 minutes or we're going to be trapped here," called out Sergeant Martinez, the security team leader. Sarah looked down at the young girl, who was finally stabilized enough for transport. "She's ready to move, but we need to take 4 other critical patients as well."
"Can you give me 5 more minutes?"
Martinez nodded, understanding the impossible situation they all faced. The security team extended their timeline as much as possible, while Sarah and her medical team prepared the wounded for evacuation. As they loaded the patients into the medical transport vehicles, Sarah could hear gunfire in the distance. The opposing armed groups had begun fighting again, and the window for safe evacuation was closing rapidly. The convoy began moving toward the extraction point, but they encountered a roadblock manned by fighters from one of the armed groups. The fighters demanded to know why the medical team was helping civilians from the other side of the village. Sarah made a decision that reflected her evolved understanding of her role. She approached the roadblock commander directly, her medical kit visible but her sidearm also clearly present. "We're treating wounded civilians, including children," she said firmly. "We don't take sides in local conflicts. Our only concern is saving lives." The roadblock commander studied her carefully, perhaps recognizing something in her manner that convinced him of her sincerity. After a tense few minutes, he ordered his fighters to let the convoy pass. All 17 wounded civilians survived the evacuation and received proper medical treatment. The young girl Sarah had worked so hard to save made a full recovery and was eventually reunited with her family. The successful village evacuation marked a turning point in how Sarah viewed her expanded role as both healer and protector. Word of her actions spread through military medical circles, and she began receiving requests to train other combat medics in what was being called protective medical care, the integration of defensive tactics with traditional medical treatment. Sarah was promoted to staff sergeant and given additional responsibilities for developing new protocols that would help other medics navigate similar moral and tactical challenges. She spent 3 months at the regional training center, working with experienced instructors to create a curriculum that balanced medical ethics with practical combat realities. "The key," Sarah explained to a class of newly assigned combat medics, "is understanding that your primary mission never changes. You're still there to save lives, but sometimes saving lives requires you to take actions that might seem to contradict your medical training." The young medics listened intently as Sarah shared her experiences. Many of them were fresh from medical training and had never considered the possibility that they might need to use weapons in defense of their patients. "What if you hesitate in that critical moment?" asked Private First Class Janet Kim, one of the trainees. What if you can't bring yourself to fire your weapon? Sarah considered the question carefully. Hesitation is natural and human. I hesitated too. But you have to remember why you're there. When I looked at Private Anderson lying unconscious in that bunker, I realized that his life was literally in my hands. My job wasn't just to treat his wounds, it was to make sure he survived to go home to his family. During her time at the training center, Sarah also worked with military ethicists and chaplains to develop guidelines for medics facing similar situations. The discussions were complex and sometimes heated, as different philosophical approaches to medical ethics came into conflict with practical military realities. Colonel Patricia Davis, the center's commanding officer, observed one of these ethics discussions and later called Sarah to her office. "Sarah, I've been watching your work here, and I think you have the potential to make contributions that extend far beyond individual patient care," Davis said. "Have you considered pursuing advanced medical training? The military would support you through medical school if you're interested." The offer was tempting, but Sarah felt that her place was still with the soldiers in the field. "Thank you, ma'am, but I think I can do more good by continuing to work directly with combat medics and their patients." Davis smiled with understanding. "I thought you might say that. In that case, I have another proposition. We're establishing a new unit specifically designed to provide medical support in high-risk humanitarian situations. It would combine traditional medical capabilities with enhanced security measures. Would you be interested in leading the medical component of this unit?" Sarah accepted the assignment immediately. The new unit, designated as Mobile Medical Security Team Alpha, would consist of specially trained medics, security specialists, and support personnel. Their mission would be to provide medical care in environments where traditional medical units couldn't safely operate. The team's first major deployment came 8 months later during a natural disaster in a region affected by ongoing civil conflict. A major earthquake had struck a mountainous area where several armed groups were fighting for control. Traditional humanitarian organizations couldn't safely access the affected communities, leaving thousands of injured civilians without medical care. Sarah's team was tasked with establishing medical aid stations in 3 different villages while coordinating with various military and civilian agencies. The complexity of the mission required all of her skills and experience. The team included 8 medics with additional combat training, 12 security specialists, and 4 support personnel. They were equipped with advanced medical supplies, communications equipment, and defensive weapons systems. Most importantly, they operated under rules of engagement that prioritize medical care while authorizing the use of force in defense of patients and medical personnel. The first village they reached had been without medical care for 6 days following the earthquake. Sarah found conditions that tested every protocol they had developed. There were over 40 injured civilians, including many children, and the local hospital had been completely destroyed. While her medical team set up triage areas and began treating the most critical patients, Sarah coordinated with the security team to establish defensive perimeters. Intelligence reports indicated that at least 2 armed groups were active in the area and might view the medical mission as either an opportunity or a threat. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining. Sarah found herself moving constantly between medical tasks and security coordination, ensuring that her team could operate effectively while maintaining situational awareness of potential threats. On the 3rd day, the situation Sarah had trained for finally occurred. An armed group attempted to take control of one of their medical stations, apparently intending to steal medical supplies and equipment. The group's leader demanded that Sarah's team turn over their supplies and leave the area immediately. "These people need medical care," Sarah replied calmly, standing between the armed fighters and her medical station. "We're not taking sides in any conflict. We're here to help earthquake victims." The group leader was not convinced. "You work for the government forces. You are here to spy on our operations." Sarah could see that negotiation was unlikely to succeed. The armed group was positioning fighters around the medical station, and several of her patients were in critical condition and couldn't be moved safely. "Give me 5 minutes to speak with my team," Sarah requested. The group leader agreed, perhaps thinking that she was preparing to surrender their equipment. Instead, Sarah used the time to coordinate with her security team and ensure that her medical personnel understood the situation. When she returned to face the group leader, Sarah's demeanor had changed subtly. She still carried herself as a medical professional, but there was now an edge of determination that hadn't been there before. "We're not leaving," Sarah stated firmly. "These people need medical care and we're going to provide it. You can choose to let us work or you can choose to interfere with our mission. But understand that if you threaten our patients or our medical personnel, we will defend ourselves." The group leader seemed surprised by her direct response. He had probably expected the medical team to surrender their supplies rather than risk a confrontation. What happened next would become a defining moment not only for Sarah personally, but for the entire concept of protective medical care. The group leader ordered his fighters to take control of the medical station by force. Apparently believing that medical personnel would not resist. He was wrong. Sarah and her team had spent months training for exactly this situation. When the armed group moved against the medical station, they encountered a coordinated defensive response that protected both the medical personnel and their patients while minimizing casualties among all parties involved. The firefight was brief but intense. Sarah found herself once again using her weapon to protect patients who couldn't protect themselves, but this time she was part of a coordinated team rather than acting alone in desperate circumstances. When local military forces arrived 30 minutes later, they found that Sarah's team had successfully defended their medical station while continuing to treat earthquake victims. The armed group had been neutralized with minimal casualties, and medical operations had continued throughout the incident. 2 years after that earthquake mission, Sarah stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., testifying about the evolution of combat medical care. She wore her dress uniform with the ribbons and decorations that told the story of her service, but her focus was entirely on the future of military medicine. "Honorable members of the committee," Sarah began, "what we've learned through practical experience is that the traditional separation between medical and combat roles is not always realistic in modern conflict environments. Medical personnel must be prepared to protect their patients and themselves. When standard security measures are insufficient, the committee members listened intently as Sarah described how the mobile medical security teams had saved hundreds of lives in situations where traditional medical units couldn't have operated safely. The statistics were impressive, but Sarah knew that numbers alone couldn't convey the human impact of their work. Senator Rebecca Martinez leaned forward at the witness table. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, some critics argue that arming medical personnel violates international medical neutrality protocols. How do you respond to these concerns?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time thinking about her response. "Senator, medical neutrality is a principle I deeply respect and uphold. However, neutrality becomes meaningless if medical personnel are unable to reach patients who need care or are prevented from treating them safely. Our protocols emphasize that weapons are used only in defense of patients and medical facilities, never in offensive operations." The hearing lasted 3 hours, covering everything from ethical considerations to operational effectiveness. Sarah answered each question with the confidence that came from years of practical experience in impossible situations. Following her testimony, Sarah was approached by Dr. Michael Thompson, the Director of Military Medical Ethics at the Defense Department. "Sarah, your work has fundamentally changed how we think about medical care in combat zones. Have you considered what you want to do when your current enlistment ends?" The question caught Sarah somewhat off guard. She had been so focused on her current missions that she hadn't given much thought to long-term career plans. "I hadn't really thought about it, sir. This work feels like what I'm supposed to be doing." Dr. Thompson smiled. "That's exactly why I'm asking. We're establishing a new institute for advanced military medical training, and we need someone with your experience to help develop the curriculum. You could continue serving while pursuing advanced education and research." The offer represented an opportunity to influence military medical training on a much larger scale. Sarah could help ensure that future generations of combat medics would be better prepared for the complex situations she had faced. After returning to her unit, Sarah discussed the opportunity with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had been promoted and was now overseeing multiple medical units in the region. "Sarah, you've already accomplished more than most medical personnel do in entire careers," Hayes said. "You've saved individual lives, developed new training protocols, and changed military policy. The question is what kind of impact you want to have going forward." That evening, Sarah walked to the same spot outside the medical tent where she had sat years earlier during her first deployment. The base had changed significantly since then, with new buildings and improved facilities, but the mountain still looked the same in the fading light. She thought about Private Anderson, who was now back home with his family, working as a firefighter and paramedic. He had written to her several times, always expressing gratitude for what she had done that day in the bunker. Sarah understood that her actions had rippled outward in ways she could never fully measure. She thought about the young girl from the earthquake zone, who had recovered completely and was now back in school. That girl would grow up and perhaps have children of her own. Children who would exist because Sarah had been willing to do whatever was necessary to save their grandmother's life. She thought about the dozens of medics she had trained, who were now serving in various locations around the world. Each of them carried forward the understanding that healing sometimes required protection, and that moral complexity was not something to be avoided but something to be navigated with wisdom and courage. A week later, Sarah made her decision. She would accept the position at the new institute, but she would also continue to deploy with operational units on a rotating basis. She couldn't imagine completely leaving the field work that had defined her service, but she also recognized the importance of sharing her experiences with others. Her final mission with Mobile Medical Security Team Alpha took place during a humanitarian crisis in Central Africa. Ethnic violence had displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians, and medical care was desperately needed in refugee camps that were located in contested areas. Sarah's team established medical operations in 3 different camps, treating everything from malnutrition to gunshot wounds to tropical diseases. The security situation was constantly evolving, requiring continuous adaptation of their protective protocols. On her last day in the field, Sarah was treating a young mother who had been injured while protecting her children during an attack on their village. The woman spoke limited English, but she managed to convey her gratitude through gestures and expressions that transcended language barriers. As Sarah cleaned and bandaged the woman's wounds, she reflected on how much her understanding of healing had evolved. She still believed in the fundamental medical principle of do no harm, but she now understood that harm sometimes came from inaction as much as from action. The woman's children, 2 young boys who couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old, watched Sarah work with wide eyes. They had seen terrible things during their journey to the refugee camp, but they were safe now, and their mother would recover fully from her injuries. After finishing her treatment, Sarah spent a few minutes playing simple games with the boys while their mother rested. One of them drew a picture on a piece of paper he had found, showing stick figures of his family standing together under a bright sun. When it came time to leave, the young mother pressed something into Sarah's hand. It was a small wooden carving, roughly made but obviously precious to its owner. The woman spoke a few words in her native language, then added in English, "Thank you for helping us." Sarah carefully placed the carving in her medical kit, next to the instruments and supplies that had been her constant companions for so many years. It would serve as a reminder of why she had chosen this path and what she had learned along the way. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of her first class at the new institute, looking out at 30 young medics who were about to begin their advanced combat medical training. Some of them looked nervous, others confident, but all of them were eager to learn how to save lives under the most challenging conditions imaginable. "Welcome to Advanced Combat Medical Training," Sarah began. "Over the next 6 months, you're going to learn skills that will prepare you for situations you can't imagine yet. You're going to discover that being a combat medic means more than treating wounds and administering medications. It means being willing to do whatever is necessary to protect the lives entrusted to your care." She paused, thinking about her own journey from that first day when she had believed healing and harming were mutually exclusive concepts. Some of you will face moments when your role as a healer and your role as a protector seem to be in conflict. When those moments come, remember that your primary mission never changes. You are there to save lives. Everything else is just a question of method. As Sarah began the first lesson, she knew that her story was far from over. Each student she trained would carry forward the understanding that healing was not passive but active, not simple but complex, and not always gentle but always purposeful. The rifle and the medical kit could coexist when both served the same fundamental goal: protecting and preserving human life. Outside the classroom window, Sarah could see new classes of soldiers beginning their own training, preparing for deployments to places where the line between healer and warrior would be tested again and again. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not to take territory or defeat enemies, but simply to ensure that good people could return home safely to the ones they loved.